Well, a Regina woman has been conducting research into the emotional trauma that many semi-drivers face. We first spoke to Morgan Beaudry in May when she was looking for truckers to participate in her research for a master's thesis. In particular, she was looking for long-haul truck drivers who had been involved in a collision that resulted in a fatality or serious injury. Well, now Beaudry has gathered her research for her master's thesis and also created an exhibit at Regina's downtown public library. And for more, she joins us in our Regina studio. Hey.
Hey, good afternoon.
Good afternoon to you. Thanks for coming in. Let's go back to the beginning.
Okay.
Why did you want to gather this information?
The genesis of this project actually came from a news story about a suicide by truck incident on the Ring Road. But the story focused on the trauma experienced by paramedics and EMTs and even people driving by. And that made me think, well, how's the trucker doing? He actually took this person's life, whether he wanted to or not. There was nothing he could do. How is he doing? So that sort of kicked off the thinking and led to the development of the proposal.
Now, you were looking to talk directly with truck drivers who had been involved in these crashes. What was the response?
Wow. Well, as you said, I came on right at the start of looking for people. I put the poster up on several trucking groups on Facebook. The response was immediate and massive. I had texts, emails, and phone calls, direct messages on a variety of platforms, from Northwest Territories to British Columbia to Atlantic Canada to Florida to Texas to Southern California and literally all points in between. Not all of them qualified for the study, but they just saw the words truckers wanted for research project and they phoned. And they talked.
What did they talk about?
They talked about how they weren't heard. They talked about how no one has ever asked them before. They wanted to speak to someone who was interested in listening. And it was amazing. And I had over 200 inquiries. We got we screened everyone, and I had everybody on board by less than a weekend. I had to close recruitment down 7 days out. We were hoping for a maximum of 12 truckers, minimum of 8. We got 15. And they all participated, more or less.
Well, just going back to that onslaught of people who wanted to talk, how did you feel about that?
Well, I was surprised. I didn't expect so much so quickly. In the first 2 days, there were 44 inquiries. The fact that they felt seen, the fact that they felt heard, trucking is one of the most important aspects of our economy. If you took trucking out of the supply chain, just try to imagine how our worlds would change. No fuel, no food, medical supplies. It's more than tennis shoes and televisions. Our economy runs on these 18 wheels, and the most valuable component in this industry is, of course, the driver, who is fragile and who is human and is having a human response to tragedy. And they didn't feel heard. And even in academia, there wasn't a lot of research. There were some very good studies, but they were done in truck stops. You can't have a lot of mental health, robust conversation in a truck stop. So I took a really different approach to the research design. I literally wanted to put them in the driver's seat. So I used this method, which, as you said, comes with an exhibition because it actually involves them in the research process as co-researchers. They came up with some of the questions. They created all the data. The photographs were sometimes literal, sometimes representational, sometimes symbolic, but it allowed them to express themselves freely without any constraints. And the data itself isn't my interpretation of what they said. It is literally what they said. And the exhibition is allowing the public to enter this conversation with them so that they can hear from the truckers themselves what kind of changes it had on their lives, how they feel affected by the memorials that they see by the roadsides, and other questions that we explored. It was phenomenal and a privilege.
What kind of changes did it have on their lives?
Well, it changed a lot of their relationships. They talked about the stress and pressure it put on their families, on their marriage, on their finances. Some of them are still trying to get out of debt related to their loss of work during this time. But after the first 3 weeks of questions, I said, well, you have the next 4 weeks. We're in here for 7 weeks together. They talked about memorials. They talked about their relationships with their trucks. And What were the positives that came out of it? This came from them. The empathy and the compassion and the consideration for how they changed someone else's lives shines directly out of all of this data. It is remarkable.
What did they say about the memorials?
The memorials are difficult. I know one of the truckers drives around with flowers, plastic flowers, in their vehicle, and they drive by this memorial often, but they have not quite worked up the courage to place them. They've stopped once, but they're still struggling and coming to terms with that in terms of they feel they've robbed someone of a loved one. Their first thought was always for others. In fact, the very first post to the very first question begins with, I was the victim of a victim. This is the consideration and care that we're seeing from our participants.
Wow.
Breathtakingly human and tender and passionate.
What was that like for you to have those breathtaking moments? They often, you said they didn't have any, no one ever asked them how they felt about this. What was it like to have them pour their emotions and their experiences on you?
It was a terrible privilege. I was glad to be able to hear them. I wish I could have taken them all in the study. The vast majority of people who called that I couldn't successfully get into the study were people who had merely witnessed horrifying events. This study was about direct involvement. They just wanted someone to talk to. They actually thought this could be like a support group for them. It broke my heart hearing all of these stories about people who felt genuinely alone. But that was another thing that came up through the study, was how, in comparing their stories and the narratives that they told, they feel that only people who are close to trucking or involved in trucking or know trucking are capable and qualified of listening, really empathically listening to them. And so they're finding peer support, informally, unstructured, but this is where they're going to get through these dark days.
Well, coming back to your project, you used a different method to talk to truckers. What is photo voice?
Photo voice is a way of doing research that allows people to express themselves in photos and in stories. So like a survey, there's a question, but the person answering it will present an image that reflects or says something about their answer, and then they'll tell a story about how this photo represents it, but also elaborate on their answer as well. Photographs transcend language. Everyone can understand what it represents. So even if you don't happen to speak it, you can still derive meaning from that. But it also allows the participant to go deeper inside themselves and to think through their answer and to try to elaborate on it in a creative way. Some of the photographs, there was one very touching one of a refrigerator with children's drawings stuck up on it. This is why they keep going. Was their motivation to get back into that truck after what they'd been through, after not wanting to go back in. Their family, their children. And he showed it that way. It was wonderful.
Well, you've shared some of their experiences, some of your experiences, and as I mentioned in the intro, you've created an exhibit at the Regina Public Library. What will we experience going through this exhibit?
You are welcome to enter their world through their answers. Every one of their stories is surprising and engaging and, of course, very, very human. You will see, when you see it all at once, you see things that you wouldn't see individually. For example, one of the things I was struck by was how about 70% of the photographs actually have a vehicle in them, whether or not the question had anything to do with vehicles. So the participants are using them to communicate. It's an important part of their lives, and it shows up passively. You'll see stories by people who are still struggling, but who have not lost hope. This is both an aspirational and an inspirational exhibition. There's nothing gloomy about it. In fact, you come away from it really feeling really good about these individuals.
Morgan, we only have less than a minute, but this was, of course, also part of your master's thesis. What's next with this?
Oh gosh, that is an interesting road. Working with truckers was surprising and such a privilege. I've never met any group of people with more integrity and more character. And they were so generous with how much they gave to the study. I mean, they put their shoulder into this and pushed. I am hoping to return to the world of trucking and truckers because this is just the very beginning of this conversation. There is so much more to talk about. They are so prepared and ready and eager to talk. I'd like to give them that opportunity, and that'd be a privilege for me too.
Well, you were the first one to ask in many of those cases.
In too many of those cases, absolutely. But what we know is they do experience effects. This is what some of the effects like. And what can we take from this? How can we inform policymakers and caregivers and people in government? So that is part of the next step too.
Well, I can't wait to hear about the next step. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you so much, Peter.